Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. My topic today is Augustine and the Common Good. This is also the title of a chapter of mine in a book edited by Rafael Domingo and John Witte entitled Christianity and Global Law, published in 2020. In my talk, I will draw on some of the sections of that chapter in that book. Global law here in the title stands for foundations of law, including concepts that may not themselves be strictly legal, but on which legal systems rely. We tend to find such concepts defined in preambles of constitutions. Domingos and Witte's volume lists specifically some Christian concepts of this kind. As you can see from the table of contents, if it is visible on the screen, chapters deal with concepts such as moral law, the common good, the law of nations, just war, etc. My chapter treats the concept of the common good as developed by Augustine. As a study, this is part of a broader study of mine on Augustinian political concepts. Other concepts on which I've already published or am about to publish include human dignity, authority, power, legitimacy, community, solidarity, and some of other similar concepts. What I will do in this talk is explain how Augustine came to use this term, the common good, and what he understood by it. At the beginning and at the end, I will also try to offer some context and explore whether or in what way any of this might still be of any relevance today. One reason why Augustine continues to be considered in discussions like this is an exchange that took place in the first 2 decades of the 20th century between Adolf von Harnack and Ernst Troeltsch. Harnack argued that Augustine really belongs to the threshold of the Middle Ages, ushering in a medieval society and mentality dominated by church, monasteries, kings and queens, crusaders, and the Holy Roman Empire, and all that. Troeltsch, in contrast, proposed a more Renaissance view of Augustine as one of the last ancient, late classical thinkers, which associates him with the ancient city-states, citizens and citizenship, civil liberties, religious plurality, secularity, civil rights, and civic duties. It may also be interesting to mention that Harnack was a friend of the Kaiser and regretted the end of monarchy in Germany, while Troeltsch supported the Weimar Republic and became a member of parliament in the new democracy. This just shows how such discourses are always embedded in their own time and their own kind of political issues. Of course, Harnack was not wrong. Augustine did have a medieval reception when we only think of his influence on monasticism, which I will mention at the end of this talk. But Troeltsch lay his finger on an important point, namely that Augustine's age, late antiquity, was a distinct period of classical antiquity, and not just one of decline and fall descending into the Dark Ages. In the wake of Troeltsch, therefore, studies like these, so for example by Eugene Tissell or Eric Gregory very recently, about Augustine as a late ancient political thinker, with a thinking relevant even for democratic modern societies today, are still being produced. This tradition of scholarship is particularly alive in the United States and feeds into a certain type of Christian input to current social, political, and economic debates, as reflected, for example, in Robert Reich's recent book on the common good, published in 2018. And this is also the wider context of Domingo's and Witte's volume. And this is a kind of Christian input, if you like, which is contrary to what is normally expected or what's the stereotypical kind of idea of what a Christian input means in American politics. In what follows, I will focus 5 areas. First, I will say something about Augustine and his time. Second, I will discuss Augustine's view of the ancient civic project and its concept of the common good. Then I will home in on more closely on Augustine's take on the divide between the common good and the particular in principle, and how it is related to concepts of private and public. And fourth, I will say a few words about Augustine's discovery of the role of human physical labor, admittedly in the specific context of monasticism, but nevertheless with some important wider implications. And finally, I will end with some concluding remarks about the possibility of that any of this might still be relevant today. So first, Augustine and his time. Augustine was born in 354 and died in 430. He spent most of his life in what is today Algeria and Tunisia, which was then Africa, an important province in the later Roman Empire. He lived in relatively small towns in Africa, apart from the fact when he traveled, say, to Rome and Milan and to Carthage at some point in his life, but normally lived in a relatively small town, was relatively well off, was educated, but still forced to take on paid work as a tutor in higher education, what we might refer to today as liberal arts and humanities, or what was then known as rhetoric. His Latin classical culture remained with him until the end of his life, even when he was already a Christian bishop later in his life. His thought, of course, was also influenced by his experiences in the more central places of his world, in Carthage and Rome, as I said, and the imperial court at Milan, where he spent some time of his life. And here I just mentioned that we cannot easily kind of separate the individual from the wider context and the wider history, the time in which that individual lived. Now the law. The law for Augustine was, in the first instance, the Roman law. And his rhetorical training provided him with a basic and practical understanding of it. So that was the prevalence, not if some people might think there was some idea of a biblical law in that sense. His primary experience was the Roman law. And later on, as in his life as a bishop, he had to sit as a judge, presiding over courts that were applying that law. Now, that Roman law was draconian by today's standards and not exactly fair, without going too much into detail. There was no equality, for example. There was very little procedural sophistication compared to today, if there was any. It was very discriminatory. Punishment was often very swift, and often it was capital punishment, and the punishment was very severe. Even high-standing personalities could be executed swiftly and then only shortly after be found innocent. It was always risky to get involved with the law, and it did not serve the majority, but tended to be used to secure, maintain, and legitimize wealth and power for a minority. Those getting a rough deal included particularly women, slaves, children, peasants, and tenant farmers who, for example, were often kidnapped by raiders and illegally sold into slavery, especially in North Africa. Once they were owned by someone, the titles of ownership counted as legal, and they had no more redress. Refugees and migrants too, people who lived away from their home, cities and provinces, could be easily abandoned by the law, their rights ignored and abused. Augustine's works, especially letters and sermons, for example, contain multiple references to all of these examples. Now, this may all sound rather trivial, so welcome to this unfair world. But in my view, it needs to be set out because it shows that in principle, the law was perceived even then as an instrument designed to serve the common good, that is, the interests of each individual, not only those with wealth and power. Even slaves had rights. And that the way it tended to work in reality was not the way it should have worked. In other words, it was abused. So that was quite generally recognized. The question was there something better that could replace it? Or if not, how could it be improved? These are questions with which Augustine grappled. On balance, of course, he was a beneficiary of the system. He represented and defended the ruling order. But he found himself also at the receiving end when, for example, friends of his on occasions were imprisoned or executed at a whim. Such experience did not completely disillusion him. He still saw the need of law and order. Tearing it down would result in anarchy and mob justice. But the experience also revealed to him the contingencies, the inconsistencies, and the flaws of the law. The ruling system in its actual state for him was not God-given, natural, eternal. It was temporal. It had originated somehow, and it would disappear again sometime, giving way to something else. The question is, for him, what was there beneath it, which is more permanent? Therefore, I believe it is simplistic to see in Augustine an establishment thinker, pure and simple, as is often done. His adherence to the established order was pragmatic, but his analysis of society and the political system was critical, fundamental, or foundational, if you like. It therefore also offers fundamental insights that can be applied to other historical and cultural contexts, including, to some limited degree, today's. A first example where we can see how Augustine thought about his time and the society in which he lived is his take on what I call here the ancient civic project. By this I mean the phenomenon of the ancient city-state with its concepts of citizenship and the common good. It is interesting that Augustine, when he thinks about society, does not take his cue from the Bible, concepts such as, for example, the people of God or the kingdom of God, the reign of God, with God imagined as an autocrat. Rather, Augustine's take on the ideal society is inspired by the ancient classical concept of the city, inhabited and run by citizens. The Greek word as we know it is polis, or better politeia in this context, whence our word politics. The Latin word is civitas. Importantly, Augustine uses the word civitas, not urbs, which is the Latin word for the built-up urban area. To be a citizen, one does not necessarily have to be urban, to be living in an urbs. Citizenship also extends to the wider territory. Augustine, in his political thinking, is primarily concerned with citizenship and with civic rights and duties, not with urban amenities. Although, as we shall see, rights do also raise the issue of access to amenities. So the question of the common good is also connected to access to amenities and to certain services that the city provides. Now, this thinking is inspired by classical Greek and Roman political thinkers, and to some degree by St. Paul, who also reflected on conflicts between private and collective interests and on social justice. It is more foreign to the Synoptic Gospels and the Book of Revelation, who indulge in the thought that God or Christ will appear like a mighty warlord and crush the earthly powerful, the oppressors, not worrying about the potential inconsistencies of such a fantasy. How, for example, could such apocalyptic chaos result in fair and just order afterwards? Augustine was not an apocalypticist. Augustine's analysis in the City of God sets out with a historical reflection, focused naturally on the city of Rome. It was an established narrative by his time that since the late Republic, Rome had been in a permanent state of crisis and decline. Beginning with the populism unleashed at the end of the 2nd century BCE in connection with the land reforms proposed by the Gracchi. Since then, political violence, riots, mob justice, wars, civil wars, tyranny had sent the Republic into an ever steeper terminal spiral of decline. Finally, the empire put an end to it. A timely recent account of this phase of Roman history, written under the heady conditions of the early Trump years, is Ed Watts' Mortal Republic, and for the final phase, I would still recommend Ronald Syme's Roman Revolution, which in turn was written under the impression of the terrible dictatorships dominating the political landscape of the 1930s, and published in 1939. Both these accounts illustrate that the loss of liberty that came with the end of the Republic did not occur within a few years, but happened over many generations. Ed Watts in particular points this out against the background of the sometimes hyperbolical responses to Trump's antics in his presidency. The USA are still a long way from the late Republic, although they will eventually get there if they carry on like this. Seems to be an underlying message in Watts' book. For Augustine, it was clear that at the beginning lay social injustice. The fact that reforms as those proposed by the Gracchi and then later also by other senators had been deemed necessary at all indicated that all was not well with the Republic, even when it was apparently functioning well. The cause of the people, the res populi or the res publica, in other words, the common good, was not served. The particular interests of a few wealthy noble families prevailed. Thus, even at that early stage, the Republic, in its proper meaning as serving the common good, was already in crisis. The ensuing instability was only a symptom of that underlying crisis. This fundamental approach led Augustine not to tie the common good to republican liberties. When eventually the empire replaced the Republic, it, rather than the Republic, was tasked with delivering the common good, or what was left of it. The res publica, the public interest or common good, consisted no longer in a republic with civil liberties and the participation of many, but in an empire of domination. Emperor over Senate, Rome over its provinces, aristocrats over commoners, masters over slaves, soul over body, God over the universe. Incidentally, it was during that same period of the early empire that monotheism began to emerge as a political theological option. For Augustine to deliver the common good, it was not necessary to have a republic of free and equal citizens. This does not mean that Augustine did not value civic liberties and political participation. Both were still possible, even in the later empire, but only as something limited, mostly to the local level, ritualized as a nod to the old republic and granted as a favor or grace, in Augustine's parlance, by those who wielded actual power, to be removed at the whim if and when deemed necessary. Obviously, this was, if it was one at all, a rather stunted concept of political freedom. Augustine, of course, conceived of freedom at a more fundamental level. We will briefly touch upon that later on. You may have noticed that the discourse of the Republic was very much about the common good. I even refer to Republic as a synonym for common good, res publica. There is no positive understanding of the concept of private interest, no notion that the pursuit of private interest may contribute to the common good. The question was never whether the common good should be pursued, but only what it was and how it should be pursued. Whether a particular constitution, democracy, aristocracy, monarchy, etc., was working or not, depending on its ability to deliver the common good. When the Republican Constitution failed, imperial domination offered a solution. In the process, some people became immensely rich, of course, others lost everything. The majority, on the whole, became poorer. If you read an account like that of Ed Watts, you will see that present-day historians can describe the behavior of ancient economic agents very well in terms of modern capitalism. but you may find it difficult to detect in ancient sources a positive, appreciative, let alone theoretically underpinned analysis of the pursuit of private gain, so that it leads to progress, for example, to economic progress or something like that. The process of getting rich was known to be sordid at best. Usually it was outright criminal. At any rate, it was a vice. Being rich, by contrast, was treated as honorable, but not as a virtue in itself, but because of its potential to serve the common good through donations, charitable giving, etc. As far as I know, there was no theorizing about the possibility that the pursuit of private gain per se could contribute to the common good, for example, by stimulating economic growth and then create some kind of trickle-down effect. Although, of course, there was undeniably economic growth and massive entrepreneurial activity and financial ingenuity in the later empire. Augustine had views on all of these areas, but I can't go into them in any detail now. To understand how Augustine approached questions of this nature, let us rather see how he defines in principle the concept of the common versus the particular and the private versus the public. As we do this, we must be aware that Augustine principally understood these terms in their abstract philosophical meaning. Augustine was a Platonist. For him, the common or the universal exists really in the noetic world only. Augustine here follows philosophers such as Plotinus and Porphyry, and I offer a few very basic references here. When reaching the Wittgensteinian boundary of what can be expressed in language, these philosophers assume that beyond this boundary, there lies another dimension, so to speak, a real world of the noetic, which is constitutive of reality in space and time, and also ethically normative regarding the destiny of human beings within this reality. For human beings possess free will and are held responsible for their acts of willing. Thus, the external, visible appearance of myself in time and space is constituted internally by a transcendent, eternal, and therefore also immortal core of myself, which exists, though not in the way I exist in time and space. It is one and whole, but also invisible, not expressible in language, thus not accessible in the way my outer body is. But I may, or indeed I ought to, inspire to become it or be it, because it is strictly I. It's my real I. At the same time, I will never fully succeed in this, at least not in this life within time and space. Crucially for our investigation at this noetic intellectual level, everything is one and the same. In Augustine's view, this is the metaphysical basis for the idea that there is such a thing as the common good. It is an idea that all human beings share. When citizens or members of a community pursue the common good in their social and political acting, they attest to the reality of this idea and share the idealism that makes them attempt to realize it in this material physical world, in their city, their civitas, in time and space, on earth. Constitutions and bodies of law are manifestations of this common shared perception and enterprise, if you like. But Augustine also sees a problem here. Strictly, only immaterial goods can be aspired to in this way, like truth or justice, wisdom. In On Free Will Book 2, he points out that it would be crazy to pursue such ideals with only one's private interest in mind. You cannot tear off a piece of truth and eat it, he writes, or drink it so that it is no longer available to someone else. What you gain from having it is not your private property. But Augustine also knows that one cannot simply separate those immaterial ideal goods from the other material finite goods, air, water, food, clothing, shelter, leisure, modest wealth, without which it is not possible to aspire to these immaterial goods. It is not enough for example, for a government to say that citizens can access free bread and games, and at the same time take away from them access to land, education, political freedoms, and opportunities to generate at least some of this wealth for themselves, for each of this, that benefits each of individual of the citizens. As long as these common goods, material and finite as they are accumulated by a few people who have them in abundance, claiming to own them legally while others desperately lack them, the common good is not served. Of course, Augustine was part of a church that claimed to offer access not only to higher immaterial goods, even to the poor and non-educated, but also to material relief in form of alms, accommodation and healthcare and similar services. But here I'm not interested in these practical aspects, but more in Augustine's efforts to explain these interconnections theoretically. One approach Augustine takes is to analyze the concept of the common good in light of the human condition as a whole, so and fundamentally, considering that as human beings we are constituted as material and spiritual beings, so this is the Platonist anthropology, he argues, it would be perverse to claim to pursue spiritual or intellectual goods while not acknowledging that the principle of the common good quite naturally extends also to material goods. But what makes us such cynics and hypocrites that we might still do this? The reality is, he argues, that as human beings we have an irresistible excessive sense of our own individual preeminence. We fail to see ourselves truly as members of a community, as a human community, or even wider kind of creational community of biological beings, for example, for the, to include nature. We pretend to live in our own, exclusively focusing on ourselves, our most individual private interest, or what we perceive as those. Considering that the material goods are finite, this inclination can become very destructive indeed, an aspect that has become more evident today, but did not escape late antique thinkers either, especially in the vicinity of big cities, such as Rome, Carthage, or Alexandria, or in places of intensive agriculture or industrial activity, for example, mining, which could kind of cause large-scale ecological destruction. At any rate, note that individualism is perceived as the problem here. This is also relevant in view of how the pursuit of private enterprise was perceived in antiquity, and in particular also by Augustine. For Augustine, this attitude is not something human beings fall into inadvertently or irresistibly, or let alone that it might be natural or good. It is a deliberate, though inexplicable, because irrational act of will, contrary to nature and to anyone's self-interest. There's a contradiction here, since by definition, the rational free will would ever only consent to what it perceives as good. The deliberate choice of what is not recognized as good is by definition irrational. But Augustine sees this as essential. No external conditions force human beings to be or act like this. Our selfishness originates from our free self itself as something we assert, to which we consent, and which we rationalize economically as something that is useful to us, individually or within our particular interest group, family, clan, robber band, nation, etc. Or to express it with a familiar economic term, for Augustine, this primeval selfish act is the act of privatization. The world as a whole, at the disposal of humanity as a common good, to be shared equitably by all, is set on a path of destruction by a free yet perverse human will, which reasons irrationally that this resource is used more profitably for private gain. Everyone for themselves, I for myself. So privatization, so to speak, is really a form of privation. Privation here used basically as an analytic term for what is called in more colorful biblical language, evil. And that this is a false economy, Augustine even expresses in abstract, metaphysical, and logical, almost mathematical terms. The false logic behind the pursuit of self-interest is that the exploitation of the common good for private ends supposedly generates a surplus. The idea is that because the pursuit of self-interest is more vigorous than the boring and inert contentedness of social mindedness and living in harmony with nature and one's neighbors, the selfish use of material goods will increase output. Instead of just the natural world created by God and the meeting of some basic needs, there arise innumerable glorious and splendid human enterprises, empires, earthly cities, as Augustine calls them, concerns of immense wealth and power for a few, yet at the same time untold misery and increasing immiseration of the many. Thus, for Augustine, the pursuit of private interest was not just one form of sinful behavior, it was the original form of sin, an aberration from nature, and he, and not only he alone, thought that this could be demonstrated even in a kind of highly mathematical and metaphysical terms. More than a century before him, Plotinus argued that the claim to make an addition to the all, the whole, the common good, amounted in reality to a subtraction. It is mathematically impossible, and that at that fundamental level, privatization of the common good means diminution, not increase. The common good, which by definition is to benefit each and every human being equitably, cannot be increased by adding to it something which serves only a few. What those few appropriate and use for themselves, they take away from the many, who are subsequently worse off, increasingly so, as this whole system enters a downward spiral. So I have here a few examples from Augustine on the Trinity, where this principle is expressed. And one extract there from Plotinus, which I just referred to as well. And for Augustine, the interesting thing about this evil will that comes from inside humanity, the individual human being, is even more poignant, as he assumed that it was first enacted when there were only two individual human beings existing. So if you have like 7.5 billion people, you might excuse it. But at the time when this kind of thinking actually originated, humanity only consisted of two individuals, as far as Augustine was concerned, and which makes it even more inexcusable in a way. But it is, of course, he sees it as each human individual's fault. You cannot blame it on anyone else. And there is no external excuse for it, especially since it is an irrational or kind of a counter natural kind of inclination. In response to this problem, which Augustine identifies, he outlines two alternatives for humanity in the city of God. One, following the vices, so love of self, greed, and the privatization of the common good by a few, resulting in increasing misery for many. The other, recognizing the common good for what it is, taking delight in it and serving it, with the result of better conditions for all, including the rich. So the kind of more justice serves everyone, is to the benefit of everyone. Augustine outlines these two paths as ideal typical alternatives. They are not meant to resemble any actual realities. Rather, elements of both are mixed in all societies, though some societies are better than others. Augustine points out, for example, that although public-mindedness and serving the common good were held to be high values in ancient Roman society, much of this was ultimately driven by a narrow interest in the greatness either of Rome herself, the nation or of one's family, the gens. So it wasn't really altruistic in the fundamental sense. And this is the context also where Augustine speaks of the virtues of the Romans as dazzling vices, which also contributed to the political instability of the late Republic, as I outlined earlier, in Augustine's understanding. Of course, Augustine also has an ulterior motive, to outline a Christian vision of the perfect life here on earth and the prospect of eternal bliss in heaven. But this vision contains certain features of how a society on earth needs to be structured politically, socially, and economically to facilitate such a life. I mentioned earlier that the Church's relief work was intended as a practical contribution in this regard, but I think that Augustine's theoretical efforts suggest far more than a program of almsgiving or occasional interventions on behalf of individuals. For example, we know that Augustine protested to the authorities that slave raiders kidnapped peasants in the countryside and sold them as slaves, thereby ruining not only the lives of these families, but also potentially harming the rural economy of the province. The collusion of the authorities in this was a destructive form of corruption, kind of destroying both the social and legal and political fabric of provincial governance, but also the economy itself, harming the economy. But how far might Augustine have gone trying to put his more radical theory in practice, which has sometimes been referred to as Augustinian communism in a French tradition of scholarship, and also Karl Marx acknowledged it in his historical works, and it's kind of history of capitalism. Clearly, his options as a Christian bishop were limited. The empire used to make short shrift of protests, uprisings, or revolutions. But even if successful, or kind of in a limited way, such actions tended to result not in more order and justice, but in chaos and violent mob rule. In his 2011 book, Sacred Violence, African Christians and Sectarian Hatred in the Age of Augustine, Brent Shaw has shown that such scenarios were actually played out in early 5th century North Africa, where Augustine lived and was active at the time. But in all of them, Augustine sided with the imperial authorities. He could not think outside the Roman imperial box when it came to these issues. I've included a reference there to Brent Shaw's book at the bottom of this slide. We do know that Augustine arranged his private affairs in such a way that he did not own personal property. He took as an example the early Christian community in Jerusalem as depicted in Acts of the Apostles 2:44 and 4:32, where it says that everything was held in common and shared according to individual need, basically a definition of the common good. In Augustine's time, and clergy were able to own property. But Augustine thought he could go further and combine the lifestyle of clergy with life in a monastic community. The rules he drafted are still in use among monastic communities of the Augustinian tradition today. In my final section, I will discuss one aspect of the monastic life which Augustine reflected on in a work in which he advised the monastic community. It concerns a further aspect of economic thinking, which we have not yet touched upon, namely the nature and role of human labor. As I indicated, Augustine was realistic enough to assume that no earthly institution could achieve conditions in which the common good would be served without an element of self-interest, be it of the institution as a whole or of its individual members. So this included the Roman state as well as the Christian church. But it seems that he found that certain smaller institutions, if you like to call them institutions, might be able to serve the common good better than others. And two institutions in particular he was thinking about were marriage and life in a monastic community. Around 400 CE, Augustine wrote 2 treatises in close proximity to one another, very, very interesting, one entitled The Good of Marriage and the other The Work or Labor of the Monks. It seems that Augustine saw these two lifestyles, married life and ascetic life in a monastic community, in close relation to one another as far as the underlying ethics is concerned, as promoting the common good in similar ways in which other institutions did not. Augustine conceived of marriage as a divinely instituted social lifestyle, as a type of social life based on friendship. It spread a veil of dignity over an otherwise problematic area of human life for Augustine, that is, sexuality, and it supported virtues such as fidelity. Thus, when Augustine speaks of marriage as a good, a bonum, what he has in mind is very much the common good. By dedicating themselves to one another, the married partners are serving the common good. They provide a public service. And we are not even talking about offspring at this point. It is simply their dedication to one another in a context, say, of wider social solidarity. The reason why Augustine does not unequivocally recommend marriage is because, in his view, it still contains potentially aspects that make people pursue their self-interest and prevents them from pursuing the common good, namely, I mentioned it already, sex, which according to Augustine hinders the intellectual life, and the procreation of children, which tends to compel people to secure their private wealth and make arrangements for the future, which is one of the aspects that leads to economic injustice. So we can see that even today with what inheritance is doing. Therefore, celibacy, that is sexual abstinence, and a life without the ownership of private property, as in the communal monastic life, according to Augustine, is the supremely appropriate human lifestyle. And I pass over here his argument why natural procreation is no longer as appropriate in this time as it was before the time of Christianity. But how is the economic life arranged in the monastic lifestyle? In answering this question, Augustine draws attention to a particular aspect of the economy, namely labor. There is an external reason for this. Monasticism had taken off in a big way since the early 4th century, mostly in Egypt and in Syria. By the end of the century, it had also become popular in North Africa, where Augustine lived. What seems to have become particularly popular was a particular type of monastic life that originated in Syria. Its adherents lived as vagrants in destitution and self-neglect, and they rejected any form of monastic communal discipline, including labor, crucially. To survive, they begged for food and money in public places, often making a nuisance of themselves. And as biblical justification for their choice of lifestyle, they invoked Matthew 6:25 to 34, where it says that one must not worry about the next day, but should learn from the birds in the sky and the flowers in the field who do not sow and do not reap, and yet the Lord nourishes them all. Augustine was asked to refute this argument and to write against this anarchic form of monasticism. He begins by invoking a counter-authority, what he refers to as the apostolic discipline, namely the Pauline injunction formulated in 2 Thessalonians 3:10, where it reads, "If anyone won't work, let him not eat either." He then expands on this against the wider background of Pauline thinking and argues that following the example and the rules, the praecepta set up by Paul, the monks ought to have compassion for the weak, abandon the love of private wealth, labor with their hands in a common effort, and obey their superiors without murmur. Consistent with the evidence I cited earlier, this exhortation highlights the major virtues which Augustine sees necessary for the pursuit of the higher common goods in the civic tradition of antiquity. Charity, the overcoming of greed, embrace of poverty, humility, including the voluntary acceptance of physical labor, a considerable issue in late and ancient Greco-Roman society, as I shall explain in a moment, and obedience to one's superiors, that is, acceptance of the existing social political power structures within but also beyond the monastery. This latter point is particularly directed against the anarchic lifestyle of the vagrant monks of that Syrian form of monasticism, who wouldn't accept any authority that would call them back to a more regimented lifestyle. Intriguingly, Augustine develops his advocacy for a regulated monastic life applying a classical literary genre, a protrepticus, a kind of literature that invokes the attractions of the advocated way of life. Considering the many unattractive features of monasticism, even in Augustine's day, so for Augustine's contemporaries, one might expect that Augustine would have found it difficult to do that, and focused instead on the ethical and spiritual worthiness of living as a monk, perhaps on the rewards to be expected in the afterlife. But not so. In truly classical fashion, Augustine emphasized the this-worldly attractions of the monastic life, freedom of the burdens of worldly affairs, a healthy diet, calm, regular hours with plenty of time for study, congenial company, and the satisfaction that one is doing a public service. To underline the latter, he goes as far as to cite an example from Roman history. To be a monk in a monastery of the type Augustine has in mind, according to Augustine, is like serving as an ancient Roman aristocrat of the fiber of Scipio Africanus, of whom history has it that he led such an austere lifestyle that the Senate needed to subsidize him from the public purse because otherwise he could not have paid his daughter's dowry when she got married. In such poverty lived one of the greatest heroes Rome ever had, and it was a rewarding, fulfilling Roman lifestyle. This is, of course, very probably hugely exaggerated. We have to imagine Scipio's austerity more like the austerity practiced in our time by, say, Steve Jobs or perhaps Jeff Bezos, rather than the asceticism of a Mahatma Gandhi. But clearly, the reason why Augustine invoked such a classical example is because among the monks he was addressing, there must have been a considerable number recruited from the respectable parts of society, so-called honestiores. For such people, it would have been unthinkable to get educated or to get reduced to a lifestyle as practiced, for example, by the vagrant monks of the Syrian persuasion. However, to be asked to perform shameful physical labor alongside members of the working classes, the so-called laborers, the opifices, was equally unacceptable to them. It was for them that Augustine developed his theory about physical labor in the monastery. To develop his argument, Augustine sets out with two Bible passages from the New Testament. The first is Matthew 19:21, where Jesus tells a rich young man that if he wants to be perfect, he should sell all his property, give the proceeds to the poor, and then follow him. The second is Paul's letter to the Philippians 2:16, where Paul urges his addressees that they should hold on to his teaching, lest he may have labored in vain. Paul probably did not refer to physical labor here, but for Augustine, this does not matter so much. He likes the sound of the word, which Paul uses here, laborare. Augustine wants to evoke this sense of hard labor among his audience. Now, Augustine's audience may have had no problem to identify themselves with the first example, the rich young man. No mention there that he had to embark on a life of hard labor when following Jesus. But what about the second reference? And note, Augustine considers both references equally authoritative, no difference to him whether they are from the Gospels or the Pauline epistles. Augustine argues as follows. In terms of social background, he says there are roughly two types of people who enter the monastery. Wealthy people, divites, who previously lived off the proceeds of their wealth, who had slaves, and who could lead lives of leisure, otium. They are the ones who are offended at the thought that they now should perform manual labor in the monastery. The second group are people who before entering the monastery lived a life of poverty. They came into the monastery from a life of poverty, as Augustine puts it, ex paupertate. They had to rely on physical labor to, as Augustine put it, and I quote, augment their meager private possessions in pursuit of their own private interest, end of quote. So he is here deliberately using this expression, pursuit of private interest, to highlight the fact that it is poverty that necessitates people to pursue their private interest, of which he thinks essentially as a vice. Because of their needy state, these people are not able, like the better off, to pursue the common good, just like that, in their otium. So what he would like is to set out the lifestyle that enables everyone to pursue the common good all the time, across their lives. In the monastery, therefore, he continues, both groups should embrace physical labor for opposite reasons. The rich should work to overcome their natural arrogance and to learn humility, to see how little is actually necessary to meet one's needs. The poor, in turn, should learn that physical labor is not just for pursuing one's own private interest. And it turns out that many of those poor who Augustine is referring to were actually, potentially at least, fairly well-off skilled laborers who were able to earn reasonable incomes and increase their wealth, even by slaves in some cases, and build up businesses, though they always remain socially members of the laborer classes. Just put this back here. Augustine says that they too should learn that performing manual labor for charity and the common life with their fellow monks and all the poor and needy who are attached to the monastery and in need of help or care is something different from working merely for increasing one's wealth, so for one's own gain, or even just to survive. When he argues like this, he seems to have in mind his concept again of the common good, and he is thinking of a different kind of society, not the reality on the ground, which was clearly different. We know from subsequent history that things turned out quite differently with the monasteries. The monastic work ethic produced huge surpluses, which led to entirely new forms of inequality and social challenges. That is, of course, a different story again. For here and now, I just note that Augustine introduces a new approach to physical labor, untypical for his age, albeit under very qualified circumstances. And I would say that his concept of labor here is influenced by his wider concept of the common good. So this brings me to the end of my talk. As I said briefly at the beginning of this talk, one of the main reasons why Augustine is still perceived as a late antique political and social thinker is a discussion between Harnack and Troeltsch early on in the 20th century. In the wake of this discussion, the idea gained ground that Augustine belongs less to the Middle Ages, but should be read as a late classical thinker alongside other ancient political thinkers such as Aristotle and Cicero, who are considered relevant for, say, modern, say, post-Enlightenment societies and political systems. One of these signature political teachings is Augustine's concept of the common good. As I explained, this ought to be understood against both his Platonist and his Christian background, and I linked his teaching on the common good with his take on the ancient civic concept, his concept of citizenship, and his ideas on labor, which he developed in the context of his thoughts on the monastic life. I pointed out that much of his thinking is fundamentally different to economic and social philosophy today, very obviously. For example, the notion of economic growth is almost entirely foreign to him, as is the idea of the pursuit of private gain as a positive economic force, whether through the use of capital or of labor. Yet some of his observations are almost uncannily timely, including his remarks on the limits of growth due to the finiteness of material resources, the destructive nature of the belief in unlimited economic growth, the false economics of privatization, and the pursuit of private gain, and the inescapability of the human factor in economics and social life. Perhaps most poignantly, unsurprisingly, maybe even unintentionally, it is in his thoughts on marriage that he explains that what economists today often tend to perceive as a fatal design flaw in human beings may actually be one of the most essential characteristics, namely their innate tendency as individuals, rather than preserving themselves and pursuing their own very individual and private advantage, to give themselves away and love and serve others. In other words, the common cause or the common good, make a common good, a common cause. Of course, Augustine admits they do so imperfectly on account of their simultaneous, also innate, though inexplicable tendency in the opposite direction, which always remains. But still, assuming that there is at least a grain of truth in Augustine's analysis, economics may do well even today to take these factors into account. Thank you very much.